A racist cop handcuffed and insulted a black woman unjustly, driven only by his own prejudice, never imagining for a second that the woman he was degrading in public, was a federal judge of the United States. Not in her robe, not in her courtroom, not with a nameplate to protect her, just a black woman, alone at a traffic stop, treated like she was nothing. Until she made one phone call to the Pentagon, and his life was never the same. It started on a regular Tuesday morning, in a quiet suburb. The kind of place where people jog with their dogs, sip overpriced coffee, and pretend racism doesn't exist because their privilege blinds them to it. That illusion shattered in broad daylight, during a routine traffic checkpoint. She was alone. Calm. Collected. She had her documents in hand, her car was clean, her voice steady. And still, he didn't care. He didn't even ask for her license. Didn't say, "Ma'am." Didn't look her in the eye. He just knocked on the window and barked with cold authority, "Step out of the vehicle." She asked, respectfully, "May I ask what this is about?" That's all it took. That single question, asked by a black woman, was, in his eyes, defiance. A threat. So he opened her door without consent and pulled her out onto the sidewalk. Right there, in front of strangers. In front of a man filming across the street. In front of her dignity. "You think you can talk back to me?" he growled as he twisted her arms behind her back. "You think you people can just do whatever you want?" She said nothing. She didn't scream. She didn't resist. But her eyes said everything. Because he had no idea who she was. No idea that the woman he was humiliating, calling another hood rat in a luxury car, was the same person who had been nominated and confirmed by the Senate. That the hands he was forcing into steel cuffs had once signed rulings that shaped federal precedent. He saw black skin and a calm voice and made a decision: she's guilty of existing where she shouldn't. And while people walked by pretending not to notice, one man filmed it all. The voice of the cop echoing, "You better be glad I don't take you in for resisting. Get used to those cuffs. You'll probably be in them again soon." The officer thought he was in control. That he had power. That he was protected by the badge and the silence of a society that still allows this. But this time, he picked the wrong woman. She sat in the back of the patrol car, breathing slowly, feeling the weight of every time she'd been overlooked, disrespected, questioned, despite her title, her credentials, her excellence. And yet, in that moment, she wasn't thinking about herself. She was thinking about every young black girl watching this happen somewhere else, who would never have the power to make it stop. Not unless someone like her made sure justice showed its face in broad daylight. When they reached the station, she was fingerprinted. Photographed. Booked. And still, no one knew who she was. They laughed about her in the hallway. The officer mocked her behind the glass. She had this look like she was gonna sue the department or something, he chuckled to a colleague. She won't get far. People like her never do. Then she made one phone call. Not to her husband. Not to a lawyer. She called the Pentagon. No one heard what she said, but in 20 minutes, a black SUV pulled up in front of the station. Men in suits got out. The captain of the precinct was called out of a meeting. Phones started ringing. Computers froze. That cop, the one who had slammed her into the hood of her car like she was a criminal, was suddenly silent. Pale. Confused. Then, recognition dawned in his eyes. It wasn't just that she was a judge. It wasn't just that she had connections. It was that she was the judge. The one from the high-profile case. The one with the federal clearance. The one who, weeks earlier, had been invited to consult on a justice reform bill with the Department of Defense. The woman whose name was whispered in powerful circles while he stood in a small-town station mocking her voice and erasing her humanity. This wasn't just a wrongful stop. This was a career-ending mistake. He tried to explain. Apologize. Say it was just a misunderstanding. But she stood there, watching him unravel, saying nothing. She didn't need to scream. She didn't need to rage. Her silence was the judgment. His badge was taken. His name was flagged. His pension frozen. And the video? It was already viral. America was watching. But justice wasn't over. Because while the world saw the humiliation, what they didn't see, not yet, was what she did after. What she changed. Who she held accountable. And what she revealed about his past. The confrontation was only the beginning. The real storm came later, when the world found out what else he had done. But the question is, how far would she go to make sure it never happened again? And what secret did she uncover that changed the entire course of that department, and made her name impossible to forget? Stay with us. You won't believe what happens next. To every black viewer watching this, we see you, we stand with you, and your voice matters. On this channel, Plow of Twist, we do not tolerate racism in any form. We believe in justice, truth, and stories that reveal the power of resilience and dignity in the face of hate. This story is for you. Enjoy the journey, and if it moves you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and support our mission to tell powerful, meaningful stories that matter. Now, let's begin. Her name was Danielle Monroe, but in courtrooms across America, she was known simply as Judge Monroe, a woman whose voice carried the weight of law and legacy. Born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama, Danielle knew what injustice looked like before she ever stepped foot in a courtroom. She had seen her father, a postal worker, pulled over 3 times in a single week for driving suspiciously, in their own neighborhood. She'd seen her mother, a high school literature teacher, break into tears at the dinner table after being called articulate for a black woman during a parent-teacher conference. Danielle didn't grow up angry, she grew up aware. Aware that justice in America wasn't neutral. It leaned. And she decided early on she would make it lean differently. She had no shortcuts. No powerful connections. Her name didn't carry weight, she gave it weight. Top of her class at Howard University. Harvard Law, magna cum laude. Clerked for a federal appeals judge who initially assumed she was the administrative assistant. Danielle learned early to speak less, listen more, and wait for the moment people underestimated her. That was when she struck hardest, not out of vengeance, but with precision and clarity. She believed in the law, but not blindly. She saw its cracks. She saw who it served and who it ignored. And instead of turning away, she leaned in. She built her career with quiet rage and relentless discipline. The kind of discipline that meant getting up at 4:45 a.m. every day, running 3 miles, eating the same steel-cut oats with blueberries, and reviewing notes before anyone else had even brewed their first coffee. But beneath the robe, beneath the speeches and the firm decisions, Danielle carried a truth most would never see. It was exhausting being excellent in a system designed to doubt you. Every room she walked into, she had to prove, again, that she belonged. That her mind was sharper. That her presence wasn't charity. She carried the invisible weight of being, the first, the only, the one they let in. And yet, she never let it show. Her calm was her armor. Her silence, a strategy. Her courtroom was a place of control. A place where evidence mattered and protocol ruled. But her life outside of it? Rarely predictable. She had a 16-year-old niece she had taken in after her sister passed. Raising a teenager while balancing national court duties wasn't part of her plan, but Danielle never backed down from what was hard. The girl, Ava, was spirited, brilliant, and often angry at the world, a world Danielle understood all too well. Their relationship was raw and real. Late-night talks about injustice, TikToks Ava begged her to watch, arguments over curfews. Danielle didn't always know how to be a parent, but she knew how to be present. And sometimes, that was enough. They had moved to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, just over a year ago. A liberal college town with good schools, quiet streets, and a community that prided itself on being progressive. But Danielle knew that even the prettiest curtains could hide mold. The neighborhood was polite, painfully polite. Neighbors waved but never really talked. The baristas remembered her order but never asked her name. There were smiles, but not warmth. Acceptance, but not inclusion. She wasn't feared. She was ignored. That morning had been like any other. Danielle wore her favorite navy blazer, hair pulled back, minimal makeup. She was on her way to the courthouse, but a last-minute detour sent her into a temporary police checkpoint, a neighborhood safety effort that had been posted in the community bulletin but wasn't supposed to start until noon. She wasn't worried. Her papers were in order. The car was registered. She wasn't speeding. Her windows were down. The sun was out. A Beyoncé song played low in the background. Everything was calm. Until it wasn't. Officer Bradley Kent had been with the Chapel Hill Police Department for 6 years. Mid-30s, divorced, former military. A man who followed protocol to the letter, except when he didn't feel like it. His fellow officers joked that he had a nose for trouble, but what they meant was that Bradley saw a threat where none existed, especially in the form of black and brown bodies. He prided himself on being tough, on not taking crap from anyone, and he firmly believed respect had to be demanded, not earned. He'd never been written up for misconduct, but only because the complaints filed against him had always mysteriously disappeared in the system. His record was clean. His conscience was not. When Bradley saw Danielle's car approach, he noticed the way she sat, poised, confident. He didn't like it. He didn't recognize her face, but he recognized her presence. Too sure. Too calm. It unsettled him. He motioned her to pull over with a flick of his fingers, sharp and dismissive. She obeyed without question. Rolled her window down. Looked him in the eye. And that was the first mistake, in his mind, at least. License and registration, he snapped. No greeting. No reason given. Danielle reached into her glove compartment slowly. She handed him the documents. Is there a problem, officer? She asked evenly, with no hostility. You're asking the questions now, he barked. Step out of the vehicle. She blinked. Excuse me. Step out of the vehicle. Can I ask why, out? Now. The door was yanked open. Her wrist was grabbed. And before she could even register the escalation, she was being shoved against the hood of her own car. Her blazer snagged. Her knee knocked the bumper. A passing jogger paused, watched for half a second, then kept running. Danielle didn't resist. Not because she wasn't shocked, but because she knew how quickly, resisting arrest, could turn into not going home. Officer Kent's voice was sharp, clipped. You think you can talk your way out? You think you're somebody? She said nothing. You dress the part, huh? Nice car. Designer bag. But you people, always hiding something. Still, she stayed quiet. As he handcuffed her, he chuckled to himself. Bet this is the first time someone put you in your place. The other officers nearby said nothing. One turned his back. Another looked down at his clipboard. In those minutes, those long, stretching minutes, Danielle felt more exposed than ever before. Not because she feared him. Not because she thought she might die. But because she knew, more deeply than she had ever known before, that titles meant nothing to a man who had already made up his mind about what her skin said about her worth. She was loaded into the back of a patrol car, her phone taken. Her wrists ached. Her pride burned. And the words he had whispered in her ear before closing the door would ring in her head for hours, you ain't special. You're just another angry black woman with a chip on her shoulder. He didn't know. He didn't know the robe she wore. The courtroom she presided over. The politicians who had her number saved in their phones. He didn't know the federal authority she carried or the reach she had. He didn't know that the call she was about to make wouldn't just change her day, it would change his life. But she wasn't ready to use that power just yet. Because she knew something even more devastating than humiliation: patience. She was going to let the system show its true face. And when it did, she wouldn't need to scream to be heard. Her silence would be the loudest sound in the room. Danielle sat in the holding cell with her back straight, knees close, and her wrists resting on her lap, the faint imprint of the cuffs still visible on her skin. She had been booked like any other suspect, fingerprinted, photographed, belongings placed in a clear bag. Her blazer had a small tear near the hem, her phone was locked away in a drawer behind the front desk, and her questions were met with shrugs or silence. No one in the station recognized her. No one even bothered to look closely at her ID when she handed it over. And the irony didn't escape her: the very justice system she had served with honor now swallowed her whole without a pause, without a doubt, without a second glance. She was no longer Judge Monroe. She was a black woman in custody. That's all they saw. That's all they chose to see. She could hear Officer Kent laughing behind the glass window, his voice rising with every retelling of what had happened. She thought she was something special, he said between chuckles to the young rookie beside him. You should have seen the look on her face when I told her to get out. That mix of fear and pride. Like she couldn't believe it was happening to her. They all think that. That they're different. The rookie didn't respond. He looked down, uncomfortable, but he didn't say a word. No one ever did. Danielle watched through the small opening in the door, her expression calm but unreadable. She was taking notes, not literal ones, but mental, precise, unforgiving. She was watching how they operated. Who laughed? Who looked away? Who stood by? After nearly an hour, an officer approached the cell and told her she was free to go. No explanation. No apology. No paperwork. Just, "You're clear," and a set of personal items returned in a plastic container. Her phone buzzed with missed calls. Ava had texted 3 times asking if she was okay. Danielle didn't respond. Not yet. She needed silence. Stillness. As she stepped out into the sunlight, she paused for a moment at the steps of the precinct. Her hands clenched. Her jaw tightened. But her face remained composed. What they didn't know, what they couldn't begin to imagine, was that in their arrogance, they had just handed her the most potent weapon of all: truth. Undeniable, recorded, and deeply personal. That evening, back home, Danielle poured herself a glass of water and stared out the kitchen window. Ava sat at the counter, watching her quietly. "Are you okay?" she asked. Danielle didn't answer right away. She finally turned to her niece and said, "Something happened today that should never happen to anyone. And it happened to me not because of who I am, but because of what they chose to see." Ava's expression darkened. "You gonna sue them?" Danielle shook her head slowly. "No. Not yet. There's a bigger conversation to have first. And I want the right people at the table when it starts." She made one call that night, to General Whitaker, a former federal investigator turned defense liaison, who had worked closely with Danielle on a recent federal oversight initiative targeting racial bias in law enforcement. He answered after 2 rings. She didn't go into details. She didn't need to. "I need you to get me into the next oversight session," she said. "Something happened in Chapel Hill. Something I need to put on record, officially." His voice shifted immediately. "What happened?" She paused. "A mistake. One that's going to cost someone everything." The next day, Danielle walked into her courtroom with quiet dignity, wearing a deep green dress under her robes. Her staff didn't ask questions. They sensed a shift, a current running just beneath the surface of her usual calm. She conducted her hearings with precision, but her mind was elsewhere. Every time she looked at a defendant, she thought of how quickly innocence could be redefined. Of how many stories had started just like hers, but ended with bruises, blood, death. She couldn't unsee it. She wouldn't. That evening, she reviewed bodycam footage sent anonymously to her email. The jogger, the one who paused for a moment, had apparently filmed the entire encounter on his phone and uploaded it to a small local forum. Someone had recognized Danielle. Someone had made the connection. And the video was spreading fast. She watched it once. Then again. Not out of shock, but study. The way Officer Kent's tone shifted. The way he gripped her wrist. The smug look on his face as he forced her down onto the hood. The way no one intervened. She memorized it all. Not because she needed it for evidence, she already had that. But because she needed to feel it. Let it burn. Let it move through her so she could carry it into the next phase. Meanwhile, inside the precinct, things were beginning to shift. The rookie, Officer Jamal Rivers, couldn't shake the image of Danielle's face as she sat in that cell, composed, unbroken. He did some research. Typed in her name. And what he found made his stomach drop. Judge Danielle Monroe, United States District Court. The articles, the cases, the awards. The video of her speaking at Columbia University. He walked into the break room and stared at Kent, who was once again boasting about how he put another one in their place. This time, Jamal interrupted. Do you even know who she is? Kent raised an eyebrow. Does it matter? Jamal's voice was low. It will. But Kent didn't care. He was untouchable. He always had been. Years of whispers swept under the rug. A warning here, a reassignment there. He believed the system would protect him, just like it always did. And maybe it would have, if this woman had been anyone else. The next day, the Chapel Hill Police Department received a notice, discreet, formal, and marked with a Pentagon seal. Request for preliminary oversight inquiry, immediate compliance required. The chief was called into a meeting. Internal Affairs was notified. Kent's record was pulled and reviewed by unfamiliar eyes. Suddenly, doors that had been sealed were opening. Cases he'd worked were re-examined. And the conversations at the station began to shift, from laughter to fear. Danielle received an invitation to speak at a federal review panel the following week. She didn't tell anyone. Not her staff. Not Ava. She simply packed her notes, chose her words with care, and prepared for the moment where silence would no longer serve her. But before that day came, something unexpected happened. Ava came home from school visibly shaken. Her hoodie was pulled tight, her fists clenched. Someone in my class showed that video, she said. Of you. Getting arrested. Danielle froze. How did they? It's everywhere now, Ava interrupted. And some of them, they laughed. Danielle sat beside her. Look at me, she said. You know who I am. What I stand for. They can laugh, but they will see the truth before this is over. Ava's eyes brimmed with tears. It's not fair. No, Danielle whispered. It's not. But fairness isn't given. It's demanded. And sometimes, it takes more than words. That night, Danielle opened her laptop and wrote a speech, not for court, not for Congress, but for the world. A statement. A reckoning. A warning. The pressure was building. The walls around Officer Kent were beginning to crack. And Danielle Monroe? She was just getting started. Because the question wasn't if she would respond. It was how far she was willing to go, and what secrets would come to light when she did. Danielle stepped into the federal oversight chamber with the grace of a woman who had walked through fire and chosen not to burn. The air was dense with tension, the kind that doesn't hum, but vibrates. People glanced up from their seats, their expressions shifting from detached curiosity to sharpened attention the moment her name was announced. She didn't wear her robe today. No symbols of power. Just a deep charcoal suit and that quiet steel in her spine. She walked to the front, placed a small folder on the table, and let the silence expand, heavy and necessary. It was the kind of silence that demands you listen, not because someone is about to speak, but because you already feel what's coming. I was stopped, handcuffed, and detained without cause, she said, her voice calm but slicing through the room like glass, not as a judge, not as a professional, not as a citizen, but simply as a black woman. She paused, letting that land. A murmur moved through the seats like a low tide. Her gaze didn't flinch. What I experienced was not exceptional. That's the tragedy. It was normal. Predictable. Routine for people who look like me. She reached into her folder and pulled out a flash drive. This is the body cam footage. I won't describe it. You'll see it. You'll hear the words. You'll watch the hands. I need you to see it, because too many people have stopped believing these things happen. Later that evening, in the quiet confines of her living room, Danielle sat beside Ava, who had gone silent ever since the video became national news. Ava had seen the comments online, the praise, the hatred, the denials, the weaponized doubt. You really gonna do this? Ava asked, her voice low. Danielle nodded. It's not about me anymore. Ava looked away, swallowing hard. They're saying you're trying to ruin that man's life. Danielle didn't blink. He ruined his own. I'm just turning the lights on so everyone can see what's always been there. What Danielle didn't expect came the next morning. An anonymous package was delivered to her house. No return address. Inside were printed documents, dozens of internal memos, complaint records, officer evaluations. But one page made her chest tighten. A prior use of force report filed against Officer Kent, filed by a fellow officer, not a civilian. Jamal Rivers. The rookie. And there it was in his own handwriting. I witnessed Officer Kent escalate a routine interaction with a black motorist without provocation. His language was demeaning, his conduct aggressive, and the incident was downplayed by superiors. The report had been stamped, reviewed, with a red mark, but at the bottom, someone had written, no further action required. Danielle sat for a long time staring at that page. Not because it surprised her, but because it confirmed what she feared. This wasn't about one officer. This was about a pattern, and a system that had made sure that pattern stayed hidden. She requested a meeting with the Police Oversight Commission. Not in court, not on TV, behind closed doors, under strict confidentiality. The Chief of Police, Commissioner Beasley, several internal affairs officials, and the city's legal counsel were present. And so was Officer Kent. He looked older now. The video had circulated, the inquiries were mounting, and while no official consequences had yet arrived, the weight was visibly pressing down on him. When Danielle entered the room, he stood instinctively. She didn't even acknowledge him. She placed her documents on the table and began with quiet authority. There is a culture problem in your department. I have documentation of ignored complaints, falsified logs, and biased intervention patterns. I have testimony from an officer who was dismissed when he spoke up. She handed over the copy of Jamal's report. This was buried. Why? The chief opened his mouth, then closed it. Beasley leaned forward. Judge Monroe, I'm not here to hear what you're doing, she interrupted. I'm here to tell you what's going to happen. Kent suddenly spoke, his voice more defensive than angry. This is about revenge. You're going after me because you didn't like the way you were treated. That's not justice. That's personal. Danielle turned to him, slowly. Do you think I needed to be treated like that to know who you are? You were already under review by federal agencies for misconduct. You just didn't know it yet. His jaw flexed. Then why were you there? Why didn't you say who you were? I didn't need to, she said. Because what you did had nothing to do with who I am. It had everything to do with what you thought I was. The room was still. No one breathed. Beasley cleared his throat. Judge Monroe, we will, she cut him off again. You won't need to resign. You'll need to dismantle. This isn't about one bad cop. This is about the culture that made him feel protected. I'm recommending a federal restructuring order. Your department will be monitored. Policies rewritten. And unless you want this entire report to go public next week, you'll cooperate. Kent scoffed. You can't do that. Danielle stepped closer to the table. You're already out. You just haven't been notified yet. He blinked. What? You're being relieved of duty as of this morning. Your badge was deactivated 2 hours ago. Your gun was reclaimed. Your benefits are under review. Kent looked around the room. No one spoke in his defense. Not this time. She turned to the commissioner. I want Officer Rivers reinstated. Full back pay. And a seat on the new reform committee. The commissioner hesitated, then nodded slowly. Done. Kent's voice cracked. This is insane. You set me up. No, Danielle said. You set yourself up. I just refused to look away. As she walked out of the room, her steps deliberate, there was no applause. No dramatic music. Just the soft sound of a career crumbling behind her and a door swinging open to a system forced to reckon with itself. But there was one more thing. Danielle had learned something in that report. Something even she hadn't expected. One of Kent's earliest misconduct allegations, sealed, scrubbed, had involved a fatal shooting. The victim? A young black man named Marcus Benton. The case had been ruled justifiable, the family silenced with legal pressure. But now, Danielle had access to everything. And she had every intention of reopening that file. Because this wasn't over. The world had seen her story. Now it was time for them to see everyone else's. Danielle sat alone in her study, the quiet around her more intense than any courtroom she had ever presided over. The file was open on her desk, the name, Marcus Benton, printed across the top in cold, clinical font. But this wasn't just another name. This wasn't just another file. Marcus had been 19, a college freshman, walking home from a friend's house on a rainy night. Officer Kent claimed he matched the description of a robbery suspect, claimed he reached for something in his waistband, claimed he feared for his life. There had been no weapon, no witnesses willing to speak, no security footage that survived. The case had been closed quickly, the family's lawsuit settled quietly, and Kent's file wiped clean under the guise of departmental review. Now, Danielle had every detail, copies of the internal memos, suppressed testimonies, unfiled grievances, and she realized with a chill that Marcus's death had been the moment Kent learned the system would protect him, not the moment it questioned him. The next morning, Danielle scheduled a meeting with the Benton family. She didn't send an aide. She didn't ask her assistant. She drove herself to a modest one-story home on the outskirts of town, where a woman in her late 40s opened the door, her eyes tired but sharp. Mrs. Benton, Danielle said softly. My name is Danielle Monroe. I'd like to talk to you about your son. There was a pause so heavy it felt like a year lived in a second. Mrs. Benton stepped aside without a word and led Danielle to the living room, where a photo of Marcus sat in a simple frame on the mantel. Danielle explained why she was there. What she had uncovered. What she now had the power to do. She spoke not as a judge, not as a public figure, but as a black woman standing before a mother who had been forced to carry silence as her only justice for too long. Tears slipped down Mrs. Benton's cheeks without effort, not because she was weak, but because grief like hers didn't need permission. Do you know what they told me? She said, voice cracking. They told me it was better to move on. That dragging it out would hurt more than help. That no one would believe me if I said my son never touched his waistband. Danielle leaned forward. I believe you, she said. And now, I can prove it. The federal probe launched within days. Danielle didn't leak anything to the press, but the scent of something bigger spread fast. News outlets caught wind of a second investigation tied to her case. Journalists began piecing the timeline together. Protests formed again, this time not just for Danielle, but for Marcus. The narrative had shifted. It wasn't just about humiliation. It was about history. About buried names and erased lives. And for the first time, the people who had once doubted began to see the pattern that Danielle had so carefully unveiled. Inside the Chapel Hill Police Department, panic set in. Officer Kent, now suspended without pay, paced in his apartment, curtains drawn, phone off. His voicemail was full, calls from lawyers, from old friends, from people telling him to lie low. The fear that had once been his weapon had turned against him. But it wasn't fear of prison. It was fear of irrelevance. That the power he clung to had always been an illusion, borrowed and easily stripped away. When he received the subpoena, his hands trembled for the first time in years. Danielle stood across from Kent again, this time in a federal hearing room under oath. The tables had turned, not dramatically, not with vengeance, but with order, with structure, with law. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply listened. As the panel asked questions, as the evidence was laid bare, she studied his face, not out of hatred, but to understand the anatomy of his fall. When asked why he didn't recognize her during the stop, Kent muttered, I didn't look close. I just assumed. One of the investigators asked, assumed what? Kent hesitated, then said, that she was just another person trying to talk her way out. Danielle didn't blink. The room didn't flinch. Because the truth was loud, even when whispered. When the time came for her closing statement, Danielle stood slowly. Her voice didn't rise, didn't break, it simply carried. This is not a personal vendetta. This is not about ego. This is about patterns. About authority granted without accountability. About the space between perception and reality. I did not seek to be arrested. I did not choose humiliation. But I will choose what comes next. I will choose that no one else gets treated like they don't belong in their own skin. She stepped down, leaving a silence in her wake so thick it swallowed the room whole. Ava was in the audience, watching everything, her face unreadable. Later that night, Danielle found her in the kitchen, arms crossed, voice low. I didn't know you could do all that, she said. Danielle poured herself some water, then turned to her niece. Power isn't in the noise, Ava. It's in knowing when to speak and when to make others listen. Ava nodded slowly. They're listening now. Danielle smiled. Yes. But we're not done. Because Danielle wasn't just rewriting Kent's future. She was reshaping the system that created him. The federal task force expanded. Other judges joined her call. She presented her findings at law schools, policy forums, and roundtable discussions with national leaders. But she also returned, again and again, to the smaller rooms, the quiet homes like the Bentons, where justice wasn't measured in headlines but in healing. And Kent? He wasn't jailed. That would have been too easy, too clean. He was disbarred from law enforcement, his record permanently stained. He lost his pension, his gun license, and any path back to a badge. But the real punishment? He had to live in a world that now knew his name for what it really stood for, not justice, not protection, but failure. He walked through grocery stores with stares instead of nods. He sat in silence when his name was mentioned on TV. And for the first time, he felt the very thing he had inflicted on others, irrelevance. Danielle never saw him again. She didn't need to. Because the final moment of her reckoning wasn't in his defeat, it was in what came after. The doors she opened. The conversations she sparked. The lives she protected by refusing to remain quiet. She had walked through hell without raising her voice, and somehow, it made her louder than ever. She went to Marcus Benton's grave weeks later, alone. No cameras. No press. Just her and the wind and the boy who never got the chance to grow into a man. She knelt, placed a small white flower beside his name, and whispered, "They know now." Then she stood, walked back to her car, and drove forward, not away, but toward everything that still needed to change. Danielle sat at her desk, the soft tapping of rain on the window creating a rhythm that somehow matched the quiet pulsing of her thoughts. The aftermath of the hearing had begun to ripple outward, no longer confined to courtrooms or official reports. The story had become national, then international, and now it lived in living rooms, in classrooms, in barbershops and churches. Her name had become a symbol, and with that came reverence, and pressure. Everywhere she went, people looked at her differently. Some with admiration, others with scrutiny, and a few with that cautious hesitation reserved for someone who had shattered an illusion too many were comfortable living within. She knew the danger of being turned into a monument while still breathing. But she hadn't done this for admiration. She had done it to shift something larger than herself, and now, in the eerie quiet that follows every storm, she had to face the question she hadn't yet asked aloud: what now? The commission had officially recommended sweeping reforms to the Chapel Hill Police Department, including a community oversight board, mandatory anti-bias training, transparency in use of force cases, and most notably, the public release of redacted internal documents related to past complaints. It was a victory on paper, but Danielle knew better than to believe that paper always translated to reality. She wanted to believe this would stick, that the public attention would force lasting change, but she'd been in the system long enough to know how often it bent to survive. It would take more than policy to cleanse the rot. At home, Ava was quiet again. The tension between them wasn't about mistrust, it was the quiet tension that comes when one watches someone they love carry something monumental and feels helpless to lighten the load. They sat on the couch one evening, the television muted, a documentary playing but neither of them truly watching it. Ava finally spoke. "Do you ever feel like people are more interested in what happened to you than in what they're supposed to do about it?" Danielle turned to her niece, surprised by the precision of the question. "Every day," she replied. "They want a story they can clap for. Closure. Resolution. But justice doesn't come with a bow." Ava nodded slowly, picking at the fray on her sleeve. "You think they'll actually change things?" Danielle paused, then answered with deliberate honesty. "Some will. Others will wait until they think no one's watching. That's why we don't stop watching." 1 week later, Danielle received an invitation to return to Capitol Hill, not to testify, but to join a policy team focused on national police reform. It was an opportunity she hadn't asked for and one she hadn't decided whether to accept. It came with power, yes, but also with politics, and she knew that in rooms like that, intentions could be drowned in negotiations. She wasn't afraid of complexity, but she feared dilution, that her lived experience would be trimmed down into bullet points and bill language, sanitized for bipartisan palatability. She stared at the email on her screen for a long time before closing the laptop without responding. Meanwhile, Officer Jamal Rivers, now reinstated and working in internal affairs, visited Danielle to thank her. They sat on a bench outside the courthouse, the fall wind curling around them like a whisper. "I almost quit," he admitted, his voice quiet. "After they buried my report, I thought I was wasting my time. Thought maybe the uniform would swallow me before I could do anything good with it." Danielle looked at him, her expression measured but warm. "You were right to speak up. Even if they didn't listen then, someone eventually did. That's how change works. Slowly. Painfully. But it moves." Jamal stared out at the city street ahead. "And Kent?" he asked. Danielle exhaled. "He's gone. But the next one's already watching. That's why what you do next matters." A few days later, Danielle received an unexpected phone call, from the attorney of a local police union, requesting a private meeting. She agreed, out of curiosity more than anything else. The meeting took place in a small conference room in a neutral location, and the man who entered looked tense, but not hostile. "We're not here to defend Kent," he said immediately. What he did was indefensible. "But this wave that's coming, it's going to hit a lot of people who've never had a chance to speak." Danielle leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing. "You're asking for leniency." The man shook his head. "I'm asking for space. Some of our officers have tried to do better. They've questioned the culture. They've stepped in. But they're afraid. They think they'll be lumped in with the worst of us." Danielle studied him. "You want space? Then take a stand. Use your position to speak up, not just behind closed doors but where it matters. You can't ask for understanding while staying silent." He looked down, ashamed. "It's not that simple." She nodded slowly. "Nothing worth doing ever is." The dilemma began to take shape in her mind. On one hand, she had ignited a wave of accountability. On the other, she now faced the burden of making sure that wave didn't become a blanket of condemnation that erased nuance. Justice required precision. It wasn't about vengeance, it was about transformation. And transformation wasn't about burning everything down. It was about rebuilding with truth. But could that truth coexist with grace? Was there a space for both mercy and consequence? Later that week, Danielle stood at the podium of a local town hall meeting. The room was full: community members, city officials, activists, officers, journalists. She had no notes. She didn't need them. Her voice filled the space like a slow-burning fire. Accountability is not about punishment. It's about honesty. About asking hard questions, even when the answers are uncomfortable. We cannot pretend that what happened was an anomaly. But we also cannot pretend that every person in uniform is our enemy. What we need now is courage. Courage from those who wear the badge to face what their silence has allowed, and courage from communities to hold power accountable without erasing the possibility of redemption. The room went quiet. And then, a voice from the back spoke up. It was a young black woman, early 20s, who stood up with shaking hands. "My brother's in prison because a cop lied. We proved it, but the appeal keeps getting delayed. What should I do?" Danielle met her gaze and replied, "Don't stop telling the truth. And don't fight alone. Let others stand with you." The woman nodded, eyes glassy, and sat down slowly. Danielle knew that moments like this were not resolution, they were continuation. The aftershock of what she'd done was still unfolding, not in dramatic headlines but in the quiet churn of systems being confronted. She was beginning to understand that victory didn't feel like a parade. It felt like work. Like exhaustion. Like walking into room after room and saying the same hard thing until someone finally did something about it. The more she showed up, the more she was asked to lead. Panels. Reforms. Coalitions. But with each opportunity came the fear that she'd become a face instead of a force. A symbol, instead of a substance. She wrestled with that constantly. Was she still the same woman who'd stood in that cell in silence, letting humiliation wash over her so she could hold up a mirror to the system? Or was she now becoming what people wanted her to be, a curated figure of strength, polished and public, but distant? Ava brought it to the surface one night, sitting on the back porch. "Do you ever wish none of it happened?" she asked, voice low. Danielle thought for a long time. "Some days," she admitted. "But then I think about Marcus. About his mother. About every person who messaged me, saying they felt seen for the first time." She looked up at the stars. "And then I wish it had happened sooner. The system hadn't changed overnight. It never would. But people had. Some eyes were opened. Some doors were unsealed. And the fear that once silenced so many voices had, in part, shifted. Now, the fear belonged to those who had once operated without it. Danielle hadn't just broken through the wall. She'd marked the cracks. And she was standing by, ready to keep pushing, no matter how long it took. But what she didn't yet know, what still waited around the bend, was that someone else had been watching everything. Someone from Kent's past. Someone with a secret. And that secret was about to force Danielle to make a choice she never saw coming. One that would test not only her sense of justice, but her very soul. Danielle was beginning to breathe again, but the air had changed. It wasn't relief, it was something heavier, more complex. She had stirred the waters, shaken the foundation, and forced the city, the state, even the country to look at what they often chose to ignore. But now the silence that followed wasn't peace, it was anticipation. And inside that stillness, something new was growing. A letter arrived one morning without a return address, just her name in tight, deliberate print. Inside was a single page, handwritten, neat. The words were sharp, controlled, almost clinical in their formality. It read, "You don't know everything about him. If you're going to lead this fight, you need to know the whole truth. Come alone." Attached was a location and time, an address in Durham, a small, unassuming law office, past hours. Danielle stared at the page for minutes, her breath shallow. She wasn't easily rattled, but this was different. Someone was watching. And they were ready to talk. That evening, she didn't tell anyone where she was going. Not Ava. Not her clerk. Not even her security contact at the federal office. She needed to understand what this was, what someone thought she still didn't know. The building was old but clean, the kind of place with buzzing fluorescent lights and furniture that hadn't been replaced in a decade. She walked in, her heels silent on the linoleum, and found a man sitting at the far end of the office, back straight, hands folded. He looked mid-50s, weary eyes, gray stubble around his chin. He motioned for her to sit, and after a beat, she did. No names were exchanged. He began speaking before she could ask a single question. "I used to be his partner," he said, voice low, but firm. "Kent. Back when he first joined the force. We were rookies together. I trained him. I watched him get shaped." Danielle said nothing, letting the silence open the space. The man continued. "He wasn't always like that. But the system, it rewards the wrong instincts. Aggression gets praised. Restraint gets written up. You start noticing who gets promoted, and it's the ones who get compliance by force, not by respect. Kent learned that fast. And he got good at it." Danielle finally spoke, her voice calm. "Why are you telling me this now?" The man looked away. "Because there was a file. Years ago. A case no one ever looked into. It disappeared. The shooting they reopened with Marcus. That wasn't his first one. It was just the first one that went public. There was another kid. 12 years old. Different city. The report vanished. And I kept a copy." He handed her a small envelope. "You need to see what they buried. You're trying to clean up a system that was designed to stay dirty. If you're going to fight it, really fight it, you have to know how deep the roots go." Danielle took the envelope with a weight she hadn't felt since her own arrest. "Why now?" she asked again. The man's eyes lowered. "Because I'm tired of pretending I didn't help build the problem." Danielle nodded once, then left. The drive home was silent, the folder untouched beside her, but its presence screamed louder than any siren. At home, Ava sat at the table, laptop open, headphones around her neck, her eyes scrolling through yet another stream of news updates about her aunt. When Danielle entered, Ava didn't look up at first, but then she said softly, "They're saying you should run for office." Danielle smiled faintly, setting the folder down without a word. "I'm not interested in more titles," she replied. "Just more truth." Ava studied her. "You okay?" Danielle paused. I'm fine. Just tired. But Ava knew better. She closed her laptop and walked over, standing beside the envelope. What's in there? Danielle sighed. Something old. Something that should have never been hidden. Ava reached out, gently resting her hand on her aunt's arm. You're allowed to be tired, you know. You don't have to carry it all alone. Danielle placed her hand over Ava's and whispered, but if I don't, who will? Later that night, Danielle opened the envelope. Inside was a photocopy of a report marked confidential, internal use only. The case detailed the shooting of a young boy named Darius Allen. 12 years old. Unarmed. The officer claimed the child reached for something, but no weapon was found. The report concluded that it was a tragic misunderstanding, and Kent's name appeared only in a footnote. He had been present. He had fired. He had been cleared. The file was timestamped 11 years prior. No media coverage. No public record. Buried. Danielle sat back, the breath leaving her body. This was bigger than Kent. Bigger than her. It wasn't about one bad cop or even a broken department, it was about a structure that protected its own while sacrificing children. And now, she held proof. The dilemma wasn't whether to expose it, it was how. If she went public, it could open the door to massive reform. But it could also re-traumatize a family who never received closure. She didn't even know if Darius Allen's family was alive, if they ever knew what really happened. It was a delicate line, between justice and harm, between power and responsibility. The next morning, Danielle made calls. Not to reporters, not to politicians, but to investigators she trusted. She began verifying the file, tracking the family, confirming the names. She worked through the day, through the night, her phone glued to her hand, her face tight with purpose. When her staff asked what she was working on, she only said, a promise. By the third day, she had everything she needed. Darius's mother still lived in Raleigh. Her number was listed under a new last name. Danielle called and introduced herself, gently explaining what she had found. The woman was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was hollow. We were told to let it go. They told us it would be better that way. Danielle's throat tightened. It wasn't better. And you deserve to know everything. The woman agreed to meet. They sat across from each other in a small cafe, out of sight, away from attention. The mother listened as Danielle explained what had been hidden. She wept silently. Not in a dramatic display, but in the quiet, aching way that only a mother who has lived too long with unanswered grief can. Why now? She whispered. Danielle leaned forward. Because no one gave you the choice to fight. I want to give it back to you. The woman nodded slowly. I don't want revenge. I just want them to say his name. Danielle understood. She began preparing a statement. Not a press release. Not a headline. A testimony. And this time, it wouldn't be her voice leading it. It would be Darius Allen's mother. She arranged for the woman to speak at the next oversight hearing, and when the day arrived, the room fell to a hush as she took the stand. Her words were quiet but carried more weight than any law Danielle had ever quoted. My son didn't have a voice when he died. Today, I speak for him. And I want you to know that silence is not the same as peace. Afterward, Danielle met her in the hallway. The woman hugged her, not tightly, but with intention. Thank you for not letting him disappear. Danielle held her close and said, thank you for your strength. As they parted, Danielle turned to find Jamal watching from down the hall. He approached, hands in his pockets. You did the right thing, he said. Danielle looked at him and replied, so did you. That night, Ava asked Danielle the same question again. Do you ever wish none of this happened? Danielle thought longer this time. No, she finally said. I wish I hadn't needed to be the one. But I'm proud I didn't stay quiet. Ava nodded. So what happens now? Danielle looked out the window, where rain had started again. Now, she said, we keep going. Because justice isn't a moment. It's a movement. But deep down, Danielle knew that movements don't survive on force alone. They need stories. They need names. They need memory. And so, she began collecting every file, every name, every buried truth she could find. Not for revenge. Not for war. But for record. For honor. For the children like Darius and Marcus. For the families who never got to hear, "We believe you." And with every page, she stitched a map, a blueprint of a system that had thrived on silence, and that would now be forced to speak. The final battle was coming, not with noise, but with precision. And Danielle would be ready. Danielle's days began to shift from the courtroom to corridors of policy, from reactive defense to proactive transformation. What had started as a personal reckoning had evolved into something larger, an archive, a living record of those whose names had never made headlines, whose stories were folded into silence by procedure, shame, or grief. She wasn't leading a revolution of shouts and marches now, she was building a movement of paper, of proof, of truth sharpened into tools. It was quieter work, but heavier, because every new file unearthed meant another family who had lived years without closure. Each name held a different kind of weight. Some were young. Some were old. Some had made mistakes. Others had simply been in the wrong place with the wrong face. But all of them had been met by a system that refused to look them in the eye. One evening, as she sorted through a growing mountain of testimonies and sealed records, Ava entered the room, her face unreadable. Danielle looked up, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Ava walked to the table, picked up a file, and turned it over. "Does it ever stop feeling like you're drowning in it?" she asked, voice quiet. Danielle sighed, brushing her fingers over her temple. "No. You just learn to breathe underwater." Ava nodded slowly, then said, "I want to help." Danielle looked at her, truly looked, and saw not the angry teenager she had once taken in, but a young woman now shaped by witnessing what truth really costs. "You already are," Danielle said, her voice carrying something like gratitude and heartbreak at once. The press began circling again, drawn to Danielle's quiet, methodical exposure of suppressed police records. Journalists were piecing together a pattern of intentional concealment spanning nearly 2 decades, and the federal inquiry, once a local issue, was now forcing national response. Still, Danielle kept her focus local, deliberate. Her office created a task unit, comprised of legal scholars, investigators, and grassroots organizers, to audit every closed case in the past 15 years where complaints had been filed but dismissed without formal hearings. Her approach was meticulous and humane. No theatrics. No cameras. Just dignity and structure. The more people she met, the more families she embraced, the more certain she became that healing couldn't come from spectacle. It had to come from exposure. From slow, painful acknowledgement. From the refusal to forget. One evening, Jamal visited again. He sat on her porch, shifting uncomfortably as he wrestled with what he needed to say. "There's something I haven't told you," he began. Danielle, sensing the depth in his tone, turned to face him fully. He exhaled sharply. "When I first joined the force, I saw something I didn't stop. It wasn't Kent. It was another officer. He roughed up a suspect. Black kid. No weapon, just his mouth running. The officer slammed him into a wall. I froze. Didn't report it. Didn't speak on it. And that boy. He ended up in juvie. I saw him once after that, years later, working at a gas station. He didn't recognize me. But I've never forgotten his face." Danielle watched him quietly, her expression a mixture of empathy and challenge. "What do you want to do about it?" Jamal hesitated. "I want to find him. I want to tell him the truth." I want to be accountable. Danielle nodded. Then do it. Not because it'll fix what happened. But because sometimes healing starts with owning the silence. The next week, Danielle hosted a closed-door roundtable with survivors and family members of police violence. No press. No social media. Just a circle of voices long unheard. One woman, whose brother had died during a transport, spoke with fire in her voice. They told us he had a seizure. But the autopsy showed bruises around his neck. I was 16. I remember my mother screaming when she read it. A man, his voice shaking, described the night he was pulled over and stripped of his dignity in front of his son. He's 10 now. And every time he sees a cop, he flinches. That's what they gave him. That's what they taught him to expect. Danielle didn't interrupt. She didn't moderate. She just listened, hands clasped, eyes unwavering. When the last voice finished, the room was silent. Then she spoke. You were never meant to carry this alone. And now, finally, they have to see you. It was in those moments, away from courtrooms and policy panels, that the weight of what she had taken on felt most righteous. Not easy, not noble, but necessary. And yet, as always, it came with a price. She received threats. Vague emails. Anonymous calls. Whispers that her career had become too political. That she was risking her impartiality. Some of her colleagues distanced themselves. Invitations to certain events stopped coming. But Danielle didn't flinch. Because for every door that quietly closed, a dozen more opened in places where doors had never existed before. She had started mentoring young black law students informally, some from North Carolina, others from across the country. They came with notebooks full of questions and eyes full of fire. One evening, a student asked her what it meant to be fearless. Danielle replied, "It doesn't mean you're never scared. It means you keep standing even when your legs shake. It means you know who you are when the robe comes off." That stuck with them. It echoed back to her in letters, in texts, in whispers of "thank you" after long talks. Then, one late night, as she reviewed a stack of recent testimonies, a knock echoed from the front door. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened it, she found a middle-aged white man standing in the porch light, shoulders slouched, holding something in his hand. "I'm sorry to come unannounced," he said quickly. My name is Thomas Benton. I'm Marcus's father." Danielle stepped back, surprised. She had only met Marcus's mother during the earlier meetings. "May I?" he asked. She nodded and led him inside. He sat stiffly, then handed her a photo. It was of Marcus, younger, grinning, with his arms around a younger sister. "I didn't fight like his mother did," he said, voice thick with regret. "I was scared. I was angry. But I was also ashamed. I didn't know how to protect him. I still don't know how to grieve him." Danielle listened, not just with her ears but with her entire presence. "Grief doesn't ask us to be perfect," she said softly. "It just asks us not to forget." Thomas wiped his eyes and looked at her. "Thank you for not letting him vanish." Danielle nodded. "He never did. He was always here. We just made them see it." The encounter stayed with her, not because of what was said, but because of what it represented, an entire generation learning to face its pain instead of hiding from it. And Danielle knew then that her work had reached a new stage. Not only confronting the system, but guiding those who'd been broken by it toward something that resembled peace. As the hearings grew, as the cases reopened, as reforms passed, Danielle remained grounded, not by titles or recognition, but by memory. By the moments alone in a room with someone's truth in her hands. She didn't know where the road would end, or if it ever would. But she knew the direction. Forward. Always forward. Still, something lingered in the back of her mind, a question that wouldn't rest. Not just about Kent, or the files, or the department. But about herself. Who was she becoming? Could she carry this burden forever? Would her own humanity survive being the face of a fight so vast? But there was no time to dwell. A final report was coming. One that could change everything, or expose just how far the resistance still went. She had seen the draft. She knew what it contained. And once it went public, there would be no going back. The truth was about to explode in every direction. And Danielle, she was ready to catch the pieces. The final report was released on a Monday morning, not with a press conference or national broadcast, but with a quiet upload to the federal website. Within hours, it exploded across social media, newsrooms, and living rooms. It was more than a document, it was an indictment, a map, a revelation. It contained names, dates, testimonies, internal memos, and patterns too precise to be called coincidence. It showed how departments had failed, how cases had been buried, how voices had been silenced. But at the heart of the report, one section stood out, titled simply, Systems of Silence. It wasn't Danielle's words, but it was her voice. The narrative traced back to Marcus Benton, Darius Allen, and dozens of other names that, until now, had lived only in grief. The ripple effect was instant. Multiple officers across the state were suspended pending investigation. 2 district attorneys resigned. One police chief publicly apologized in a televised address, admitting that the culture they'd maintained was a betrayal of public trust. But the most surprising turn came not from the justice system, but from the people. Communities began holding local truth forums, where families and officers sat in the same room and shared what they had experienced. Pain surfaced, but so did understanding. Danielle was invited to the first one in Chapel Hill, where she sat quietly in the back as a former officer stood before a crowd and said, "I stayed silent for years. I didn't know how to admit what I'd seen. But silence is complicity. And I don't want to carry that anymore." The room didn't erupt into applause. It didn't need to. The quiet nods, the shared eye contact, the unspoken acknowledgement, those were louder than clapping hands. Officer Jamal Rivers was offered a leadership role in the newly formed Community Accountability Task Force, a position that would have once seemed unreachable for someone who had nearly been pushed out for telling the truth. He accepted, but only after asking Danielle one question over coffee: "Do you think people really change?" Danielle looked at him with a smile that was both weary and hopeful. "Some don't," she said, "but some do. And the ones who do, those are the ones we fight for." Jamal made it his mission to train new recruits in de-escalation, implicit bias, and the power of listening before speaking. His classes were uncomfortable, sometimes tense, but always necessary. Ava, now 17, began organizing student-led workshops at her school. She invited local leaders, trauma counselors, and even survivors of police misconduct to speak. She turned pain into education, fury into clarity. One day, Danielle watched her niece speak on stage at a youth summit, her voice steady, her eyes bright. "We're not waiting for the world to fix itself," Ava said. "We're learning how to fix it together." Danielle didn't cry, but something inside her finally exhaled. Thomas Benton, Marcus's father, started a foundation in his son's name. It provided scholarships for students pursuing criminal justice reform and mental health services for families affected by state violence. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, he stood beside his ex-wife and said into the microphone, "We lost our son, but his story will protect others. That's the legacy we choose." Danielle attended, standing quietly in the back once again, not seeking recognition, only presence. And Officer Kent? He moved away from North Carolina. Disgraced, disconnected, and without his badge, he faded from public discourse. No charges were filed, his misdeeds, while immoral, remained in the shadowy gray of legality. But what hurt him most wasn't prison. It was irrelevance. The badge had given him an identity. Without it, he became a man the world had already decided to forget. His face no longer inspired authority. It inspired questions. suspicion, and silence. As for Danielle Monroe, her next chapter didn't begin in another courtroom, or a Senate hearing, or on the cover of a magazine. It began quietly, in a converted community center where she launched a new nonprofit called the Memory Project. Its mission was simple but profound: to collect and preserve the stories of those affected by systemic injustice, and to turn their experiences into training material for law schools, police academies, and government institutions. She refused to let pain be recycled into entertainment or sensational headlines. She insisted it be documented, studied, and most importantly, understood. One afternoon, after a long day of interviews, Danielle walked out into the sunlight and stood still, eyes closed. For the first time in what felt like years, she didn't feel the crushing weight of what still needed to be done. She felt the presence of what had already been done. Not fixed, not finished, but moved. Shifted. She had not just survived the worst moment of her life. She had transformed it. And in doing so, she built something lasting, something rooted not in vengeance, but in visibility, in truth, in memory. Now I ask you, the one listening to this story, what does justice mean to you? Is it punishment, or is it change? Is it silence, or is it speaking out, even when your voice trembles? Danielle's journey was never about revenge. It was about reclaiming dignity, not just for herself, but for every name that never got spoken, every story that was cut short, every mother who buried her child without answers. And now you've heard it. You've walked with her. Felt the sting of humiliation. The weight of truth. The tremble of choice. So what will you do with it? Will you sit with this story, let it pass through you, and leave unchanged? Or will you carry it with you into the next conversation, the next room, the next decision? Because this story wasn't just about Danielle. It's about us. All of us. If this story moved you, made you think, made you feel, share it. Speak about it. And remember, silence protects no one. And truth, no matter how buried, always finds a way to rise. If you believe in stories that challenge, that heal, that ignite change, subscribe to Tales of Twist and join us on this journey of justice, truth, and unforgettable turns. Because here, we don't just tell stories. We honor them.